She was a hard-working single mother with a smile that could light up a room.
She had the perfect smile, perfect teeth, these big, bright eyes.
She always could make you laugh.
She was petite, but she was larger than life.
He was someone who could match her energy.
She wanted somebody to be an equal, to be a partner.
She had made like a Facebook post, oh, the love of my life. He was along for the ride.
But in the middle of a spring night, her life ends in unimaginable horror.
The violence, the trauma, that is serious anger.
She was tortured. That was hate, a demon. Just like, how evil could you be to do that?
Was it a case of unrequited love?
She had just broken up with him, and now she's dead.
This subject is scorn.
Or did a pattern of violence escalate to murder?
He's popping up at her job, stalking her.
He said that he was gonna f her up.
I think she knew that she had to get away.
The fact that my sister was screaming for her life and nobody heard her, it's haunting.
2016. It's a quiet night in Concord, California, a suburban community 30 miles east of San Francisco.
It's just one of those bedroom communities that grew and grew and grew.
Concord, California is a wonderful city. It has great schools, it has great neighborhoods. It's just a really nice place to raise a family.
But at 2:30 a.m., the quiet tranquility is broken by the sounds of sirens.
I was woken up in the middle of the night from my sergeant, and he asked that I respond for a possible homicide at Duck Pond at Newhall Park. A couple guys were out in the middle of the night going to fish, and they came across the victim.
This way, detectives.
Thank you, officer.
The scene was wrapped with crime tape. There was a couple officers out there kind of working scene security, and as I approached the pond, I could see the victim. She had a large laceration to her head that was obvious that she had suffered major trauma.
She had multiple fractures all over her face. She was beaten countless times, and she was also strangled. The attack was beyond brutal.
The victim had literally her fist shoved inside her mouth. And that's something I've never come across. It's right up there with some of the worst violence I've seen through the decades.
But who is this woman that suffered such a tragic fate?
Here you go, detective. Thank you.
The patrol cars have a portable fingerprint reader, and it's just like it sounds. You can take it out, put it up against somebody's thumb, then a match will show up.
When investigators scan the woman's prints, they get a hit.
The victim is 25-year-old Poinsettia Parks.
Born and raised in the suburbs of San Francisco, Poinsettia always stood out because of her small size.
Her friends called her Shorty. She was very, very small, very petite. She had the perfect smile, perfect teeth, these big, bright eyes.
What Poinsettia lacked in stature, she more than made up for in personality.
She was petite, but she was very mighty. And she just had a personality that was larger than life.
She always could make you laugh, and a lot of friends were attracted to her kindness and her funniness.
She just really, truly loved other people.
Never one to shy away from the spotlight, Poinsettia discovered a passion for the performing arts early in life.
She was very good at acting. She was in the Wiz at Pleasant Hill Middle School. And everybody came up to me afterwards asking me, where did she learn how to act? Where did she learn how to sing?
And as she grew into a young woman, she was determined to turn her passion into a career path.
I said, well, Poinsettia, what do you want to do? And she said, I want to do children's theater. And I said, well, all you have to do is start.
But at the age of 17, Poinsettia's plans for her future were put on hold when she and her high school sweetheart, Tyler Combs, got some surprising news.
She found out she was pregnant.
When she's pregnant, like, she'll stop everything she's doing. She'll eat healthy. She'll sit there and read to the baby. That's the type of mother she is.
And when her daughter Angelique was born, Poinsettia couldn't have been happier.
She was a good mother. Very, very energetic, very engaging.
It was always fun when I was with her. My mom was a happy person. She was goofy.
But as much as they loved their daughter, Poinsettia and Tyler struggled to adjust to their new role as parents.
It was difficult because she had postpartum depression for a while.
It was too expensive. How soon can two teenagers from the Bay Area get their stuff together? This is Silicon Valley. If you're not making 6 figures or more, how long is it really gonna take for you to get it together?
Poinsettia and Tyler did not end up staying together. They broke up.
In the wake of the breakup, Poinsettia's family stepped in to help with baby Angelique.
Our great aunt would come get her every weekend. And then she was like, well, let me just keep her. Let me keep her until you get yourself together.
She wanted to be a good mom. And I would take her up to see her daughter. We'd go to the park.
And I remember being at the park with her and we were running around, having fun. And she was just super joyful.
She was looking forward to doing whatever she had to do to get her back.
Even if that meant working around the clock to save up money for an apartment.
She wanted to better her life and be able to provide for her young daughter.
At that time, she worked in a beauty supply store, and then she also worked for security at Safeway, which everybody thought was hilarious because you got this tiny person chasing after criminals.
It was pretty dangerous, but she was just fearless.
By her early 20s, Poinsettia was also fearless in love.
She was dating, getting to know people.
She wanted somebody to be an equal, to be a partner, a supportive person, that you support them and they support you.
She doing
Hi.
So when Poinsettia began building a relationship with 26-year-old Eric Lamar Nelson, he seemed like just the supportive partner she'd been searching for.
He wasn't scared off by the fact that she had a child.
She thought he was good looking. He was tall.
I'm really excited to go out tonight.
Yeah?
Work has been really crazy.
The first time I was made aware of Eric was around Christmas. She had made a Facebook post, oh, the love of my life, and where would I be without you?
She never had a long, steady relationship for a long, long time. I think that's what she wanted.
And she finally found someone who was also along for the ride.
But now, Poinsettia has been found murdered at a park in Concord, California.
The brutality of it definitely stands out.
The amount of blows and damage was definitely shocking. She had lacerations all over her face. She had a broken nose. She had bruising from her chin down to her clavicle.
Her hand, was found in her mouth.
When her hand was removed, it was learned that her tongue was actually split in half. There's no way that you can look at the injuries that Poinsettia sustained and not think that this was personal.
Investigators believe Poinsettia's killer was trying to send a message.
I think the splitting of her tongue and shoving her hand in her mouth was symbolic.
To me, it seems that somebody might have been upset about something she was going to say.
That definitely is sending a message that I am silencing you.
But who was trying to silence Poinsettia, and why?
It's definitely something that would only be done with a lot of anger behind it.
25-year-old Poinsettia Parks was working hard to create a safe haven for her young daughter, with her boyfriend Eric Nelson by her side.
She held 2 jobs. She was hardworking. She had goals.
She had the intent to get her daughter back and just starting anew.
But when Concord police discover Poinsettia brutalized and left for dead at a local fishing pond, the hunt is on for her killer.
It's obvious that there was some anger involved. Shoving someone's hand inside their mouth, it's definitely something that would only be done with a lot of anger behind it.
As investigators scour the area for clues, they discover that the fight for Poinsettia's life began in a nearby parking lot.
They found Poinsettia's wig kind of up near the parking lot area. They found a lot of different markings with blood.
It's plausible that some type of argument occurred in or around their car, that it became violent, and at some point, either the victim ran or the victim fought.
There was a struggle from the parking lot all the way down to the pond. There was a guardrail that separated the parking lot from the pond, and on that guardrail was a palm print, and it was blood.
We took photos of it, and we ended up taking the entire guardrail, preserved it.
As the sun comes up over Northern California, detectives head to the home of Poinsettia's mother, Andrella Bohanna.
Given these type of notifications, they're difficult. We knocked on the door, identified ourselves, and she could tell us something was wrong immediately.
I look at him, and then I'm like, is it my daughter? And after they told me, I dropped to the floor and I just screamed and cried.
Andrella tells the detectives that Poinsettia's death is even more devastating because of something her daughter told her a few weeks earlier.
Poinsettia, she was pregnant.
She was expecting another child. She was 6 weeks pregnant.
She was trying to keep a secret. She was trying to hint around, but she can't hold water. She just had to blurt it out.
Do you know who the father of the child was?
Yes, his name is Eric Nelson.
Andrella tells detectives that Poinsettia and Eric had dated for about 9 months. But recently, the young couple split up.
With the added pressure of a pregnancy, their relationship just couldn't cut it.
Do you think he'd be involved in with what happened last night?
Eric? I don't think so.
I just didn't think of Eric that he would want to actually hurt her. I mean, I know they had arguments and stuff, but I didn't think he would hurt her.
Since her breakup with Eric, Andrella says her daughter had actually started dating someone new, a man named Gerald Cook.
What can you tell us about him?
Not much, but I know that he worked with Poinsettia. That's how they met.
Gerald also worked at the Safeway, where Poinsettia worked security.
The relationship started off as friends, and then you spend a lot of time with someone, you start developing like romantic feelings for them.
Detectives are eager to speak with Gerald Cook. But first, they have another important question for Poinsettia's mother.
Is your daughter's car here? We did locate it from the crime scene.
No.
Her car is a green 4-door vehicle. As far as her mom knew, Poinsettia doesn't share the car with anyone, so the car should have been wherever she is. It's very possible that the suspect is with her vehicle.
Police issued an APB advising law enforcement agencies in the area to keep an eye out for Poinsettia's car.
Thank you for your time, ma'am. We're sorry again for your loss.
The tragic news quickly spreads to the rest of Poinsettia's family.
I remember being with my aunt, and she got a phone call. And she stepped outside, and then when she came back, she was crying and upset, and I kept asking her what happened. She didn't want to tell me, and then finally she told me, like, your mother passed away. I wasn't really sure what to think or how to feel in the moment. It definitely was a weird feeling.
I didn't want to believe what I was hearing. I fell to the ground and had an anxiety attack. I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was being suffocated, like somebody was jumping up and down on my chest like it was a trampoline. So it just was very overwhelming.
Back at the station, detectives bring Poinsettia's new boyfriend, Gerald Cook, in for questioning.
Gerald was concerned. He wanted information. He wanted to know what happened.
She was found dead earlier this morning.
What?
He genuinely appeared to be upset learning what had happened to Poinsettia.
And you two were in a dating relationship. Is that correct?
Well, we were. Until yesterday.
Gerald said that Poinsettia had just broken up with him hours before she was found dead.
At this point, you don't know how into this relationship Gerald was, right? And then it's cut off out of nowhere, and how would he react to that?
She had just broken up with him, and now she's dead. It's not looking good.
May 2016, Concord, California. Detectives investigating the brutal murder of pregnant mother Poinsettia Parks are speaking with a man she'd recently been dating before she was killed, a coworker named Gerald Cook.
You look at acquaintances, you look at friends, somebody caused these injuries. As far as who and why, you don't know yet.
And this was a very personal attack on her.
Gerald has just revealed that he and Poinsettia broke up the day before her body was discovered.
I think he was aware that it looked suspicious. She had just broken up with him, and now she's dead.
How long were you two together?
Since April.
They were dating about a month. She'd spent a lot of time with him, even spending time with his family.
Were there any issues between you and Poinsettia?
No, never.
He appeared to have genuine feelings for her.
He has nothing but positive things to say about my sister. Like, he really liked her.
He was hoping that they could become more serious.
But Gerald says Poinsettia wasn't on the same page.
When she called to break up with me, it was around 6:15 p.m. And that was on the 15th. Really? Are you sure?
It felt like just out of the blue, right?
She said she had made some type of plans to go down to Las Vegas.
She was going to move in with her sister.
I'm sorry. I just can't do the long distance thing right now.
She said, I need a new start. She didn't really specify what she wanted to do. She just needed to get out of the area. She needed a new environment. And so we agreed that she would come to Vegas and live with me and just start over.
When Poinsettia, broke it off with Gerald, he was obviously upset.
That's what you really want?
I'm sorry.
Bye.
You have to consider the possibility that this subject is scorned. He finds out possibly that this developing relationship is going to come to an end, and he could be upset about that. He could act out. He could get violent.
So where were you last night, Gerald?
I was at home, just playing video games, trying to take my mind off things.
Gerald insists he would never do anything to hurt Poinsettia, but he says there's someone else who might.
Have you guys talked to her ex-boyfriend, Eric?
No. Why?
Listen, that guy's a straight-up psycho.
According to Gerald, Eric Nelson has been acting strange ever since Poinsettia broke up with him.
Gerald informed detectives that her ex was showing up at her job. He had been keeping tabs on her.
He would come into the store and follow her around. Eric even broke a window in her car.
But is Gerald telling the truth, or is he just trying to lead investigators off his trail?
You have a conversation with Gerald, and you take the information you gather and you consider it, but he's not ruled out yet.
You have to determine, what do I have that can prove or disprove his story?
Detectives begin reaching out to Poinsettia's friends and coworkers to verify Gerald's account of Eric Nelson's alarming behavior.
There were things that had happened in the past few weeks or past couple months that employees had witnessed related to Eric's badgering and hassling of Poinsettia.
When a friend of Poinsettia's named Justin Marsh comes in, he's able to provide detectives with shocking new details about the couple's tumultuous relationship.
Thank you for coming in, Justin.
Of course.
That particular friend, he took effort into trying to look after Poinsettia,
which meant protecting her from Eric.
This guy's dangerous.
This friend had noticed the escalation of his behaviors, and it wasn't just little things being said here and there. These were like big gestures, making threats, stalking her.
He had a lot of little bits that gave him justification for thinking that Eric was related to this.
Especially because of something that happened a couple weeks ago.
Apparently, before Poinsettia worked up the courage to leave Eric, she made a shocking discovery amongst his belongings.
He was using meth.
That was the final straw for her. Poinsettia didn't want her children around that.
She was ready to cut Eric out of her life for good.
So she sent Justin to return Eric's possessions.
He had brought property to Eric from Poinsettia just so she didn't have to see him. And when he dropped off this property, he was upset.
Well, Poinsettia, she's not here. It's just me. Little.
He said that he was going to her up.
Detectives investigating the murder of 25-year-old Poinsettia Parks have a new prime suspect, her ex-boyfriend and father of her unborn child, Eric Nelson.
He was stalking Poinsettia. He was harassing Poinsettia.
And Poinsettia's friend Justin says the situation had recently progressed into a ticking time bomb.
After they were broken up, she sent me to give him some of his stuff back.
She didn't want any contact with him.
Well, Poinsettia, she's not here. It's just me.
What?
That little what?
He said, when I dropped off our property, Eric was upset, and he said that he was going to f her up.
Normal, rational people are gonna move on from that point. But in this case, his reaction, no. This guy wants a confrontation, is what he wants.
I ain't playing, man.
What's that supposed to mean, huh?
Justin says not long after that, Eric paid Poinsettia a visit at work.
I just want to talk to you.
Leave me alone and get the hell out of here, please, Eric!
He became violent with Poinsettia.
Eric ripped her wig off, which is the ultimate form of like humiliation.
Now what?
He did that in front of people with the intention of embarrassing her, with the intention of demeaning her.
To detectives, this incident is especially telling.
They found Poinsettia's wig at the crime scene, ripped from her head, just like the incident Justin is describing. It suggests a pattern of abuse.
He just wouldn't leave her alone.
Justin says as hard as Poinsettia tried to rid herself of Eric, he refused to back down.
What are you doing here?
I love you, I love you, I love you. I cannot live without you, baby. Please, I cannot live without you, baby.
There was an incident where apparently Eric had ingested pine salt and was chasing Poinsettia around saying he's gonna kill himself and she's gonna witness it.
This may have been his last-ditch effort to control her. Okay, you're gonna leave, I'm gonna kill myself so that you can live with this forever.
But Poinsettia held her ground.
I need to talk to you.
Get out!
I need to talk to you.
Poinsettia realized that the only way to finally rid herself of her ex was to leave town altogether.
Jesus.
We spoke 2 days prior to her murder, she called me and she asked if she could come move to Las Vegas. And she said, you know, I want to just start over.
I think Poinsettia knew that she was in danger. And I think she knew that she had to get away.
Tragically, Poinsettia never got the chance to make her fresh start.
48 hours later, she was dead.
And detectives now believe they've identified the man responsible for taking her life.
Eric was the primary suspect in this investigation.
But tracking down Eric Nelson is complicated.
You try and find contact information for him, but he didn't have a recent address and he didn't have his own cell phone. He would borrow phones, so it was difficult.
Investigators discovered that this isn't Eric's first run-in with the law, not by a long shot.
Mr. Nelson had a pretty significant criminal history.
He had crimes of violence, he had property crimes, he had narcotic-related crimes.
While they wait for leads on Eric's whereabouts, investigators continue building their case against him. And when detectives receive a call from the coroner's office, they have another breadcrumb to follow.
During the autopsy, they look at the victim's clothes, and inside one of her front pockets, she had a receipt from the grocery store within a couple miles of the duck pond.
And so Concord Police Department holds surveillance from that grocery store.
Just after the purchase was made inside the store, which was a notebook, she can be seen exiting the store.
And she's not alone.
Boom. That's him.
It's clear that she's exiting the store with Eric.
Investigators now have footage placing Eric with Poinsettia just 4 hours before her body was discovered.
That's a huge piece of evidence, without question.
In the weeks before she was murdered, Poinsettia Parks was desperately trying to escape an abusive relationship with Eric Lamar Nelson.
Stop! Get out!
She definitely feared him, and she knew that she needed to physically and emotionally separate herself from him.
Now, homicide detectives have discovered surveillance video that places Poinsettia with Eric just a few hours before she was found dead in a local park.
Boom. That's him.
The fact that you see her exit the store with Eric, those are first real solid digital evidence to show that he was physically with her really close to the time that she was located.
He was the last person to be seen with her.
But after days of searching for their suspect, Eric is still nowhere to be found.
Once police exhausted all their avenues to locate Eric, it became apparent he wasn't just a hard man to find. He was actually on the run.
There wasn't really anybody that you could go to and really develop good information on his whereabouts.
He had friends and family here and there that were willing to help him evade the law.
But detectives do get one useful tip from Eric's parole officer.
A lot of times, Eric would stay with his friend, Wayne Robbins. He could possibly be hiding out there.
We eventually contacted Wayne, who came down to speak to us.
In a police interview room, Wayne is reluctant to provide the investigators with much information.
Information had to be kind of pulled out of him. He gave a lot of yes and no, vague answers.
However, Wayne does admit that Eric showed up at his house around 1 a.m. on the night Poinsettia was killed.
What type of car was he driving?
A green sedan.
Eric showed up at his confidant's home in Poinsettia's car without Poinsettia.
Hey, man. You okay? I've been trying to reach you all night. Yeah, I'm fine.
He said that Eric his term was heartbroken about the separation from Poinsettia.
But Eric wasn't just heartbroken, he was also angry.
Mr. Nelson had a pretty significant criminal history, and at the time of this murder, Mr. Nelson was on parole for robbery.
Poinsettia had told Eric that she was going to contact his parole officer as like a last effort just to get him to stay away.
If Mr. Nelson didn't leave her alone, she was going to go to his parole agent and tell the agent about all the things that Mr. Nelson had been doing, including his harassment.
For detectives, this information calls to mind an important detail from the crime scene.
She was found with her tongue slit and her hand shoved in her mouth.
This was the first time and the only time we learned of any detail that could explain why Poinsettia had her hand shoved in her mouth.
It was symbolic of his efforts to silence her, to prevent her from speaking to his parole officer.
Where's Eric now?
Oh, no, I haven't seen him since that night.
Wayne claims that when he woke up the next morning, Eric was gone, and so was Poinsettia's car.
But even with Eric still on the lam, police finally locate Poinsettia's missing vehicle on May 25th.
Poinsettia's car is found in Stockton, which I think is about 30 to 40 miles away.
It was located basically in a kind of an abandoned state. It had the driver's side window shattered.
They looked over the car and found that the car had intentionally been lit on fire.
The vehicle did not become completely engulfed, but there was a lot of black soot in the car. The passenger seat was destroyed during the fire.
Despite the extensive damage, one piece of evidence survived the blaze.
Look at this.
There was what appeared to be the rings from a notebook. That has relevance because Poinsettia had purchased a notebook at the grocery store that she was seen on video with Eric the night before she was located at the park.
It's even more evidence tying Eric to Poinsettia on the night she was killed. But where is he now?
They searched the car extensively. They canvassed the area, but no one knew where Eric was.
However, that changes when a call comes in to Concord police from out of state.
A little more than a week after Poinsettia was located, we received a call from Reno Police Department.
Detective Bardella speaking.
Eric has stolen another vehicle.
He drove off the side of the road.
I believe it was a coward move.
For more than a week, California police have been searching for Eric Nelson, the prime suspect in the murder of Poinsettia Parks.
He was on the run. It's like we were right behind him each time.
But now, Concord detectives learn that after setting Poinsettia's car on fire and abandoning it in Stockton, Eric had stolen another vehicle.
He drove off the side of the road, off the side of the freeway. He was injured, but he was able to walk away from the collision.
He then hitched a ride from two Good Samaritans that didn't know who he was to a local church. And then at the church, he told the pastor that he was wanted for murder in California.
Fortunately, the pastor encouraged Eric to turn himself in.
Reno police at that time informed us that they had Eric in custody. I think that Eric, in the end, a lack of family, a lack of friends, a lack of locations to go to, he probably was tired of running.
Thanks. We'll be there soon.
When Concord detectives arrive in Reno, Eric agrees to speak with them.
He waived his Miranda rights and agreed to speak to me, but he was very limited in information that he would share.
Eric says the car crash was another attempt to take his own life.
I just don't want to be here anymore.
He, in his own words, tried to commit suicide.
I believe he didn't want to get shot down. I believe it was a coward move.
Did you kill Poinsettia?
No.
He didn't admit to being the primary suspect in this homicide. He didn't admit to being with Poinsettia at the time of the incident or prior.
And how do you explain this video from last Sunday?
I brought up the footage of Poinsettia and Eric in the grocery store, and he dismissed it, saying something similar to, "Oh, you've got video."
By the end of the interview, investigators are ready to charge him with first-degree murder.
I would have liked to have a confession, of course, but that would have been more the cherry. That wasn't the cake.
In this case, the evidence just speaks for itself.
And when Eric's trial begins in March 2021, prosecutors let the evidence do all the talking.
Mr. Nelson knew that Poinsettia was moving on, and he did not want her to move on.
He was losing his power and control. That's what it's about.
There was nothing that made me think that he was going to be content with their relationship coming to an end.
No one knew exactly how, but Eric must have talked Poinsettia into letting him accompany her to the store on the afternoon of May 15th.
I would think that they were spending time together, probably because Eric had forced himself upon her.
It's hard to completely cut the father of your child out of your life, which is why Poinsettia was planning to move to Las Vegas in the next couple of days.
I think that she knew that something was about to happen, and she was trying to buy herself some time.
They go to the park, they have a conversation. Something happens, something that makes Eric become super angry.
I need you to understand that this is over for good.
Mr. Nelson knew that either Poinsettia was going to be moving to Las Vegas with his child, or if he didn't leave her alone, she was going to snitch on him and tell his parole officer about the things that he had been doing.
He was a violent criminal. He had 2 strikes already.
In California, there's what's called the 3 strikes law. If Eric was convicted of another crime, he was running the risk of a life sentence.
Oh, you're gonna regret this.
Prosecutors believe that's what ultimately convinced Eric to silence Poinsettia forever.
He did what Eric does, get physical. And I can only imagine the brutality of it. It wasn't over in a second.
It's not easy to kill somebody, beating him to death. It takes time.
Seeing the injuries that were inflicted upon Poinsettia, I had never seen anything quite like that. It was such a vicious and sustained attack.
Poinsettia was 6 weeks pregnant, and it's like, wow, not only did you kill her, you also killed this baby that was inside of her. Just like, how evil could you be to do that?
As the prosecution rests their case, they offer one final piece of evidence they say proves Eric's guilt beyond any doubt.
When law enforcement processed the crime scene, they located a bloody handprint near the edge of the pond.
That palm print matched Mr. Nelson's palm print.
It doesn't take long for the jury to reach their verdict.
When the jury found Mr. Nelson guilty, I felt this overwhelming sense of just, thank you for serving justice. And I knew that Poinsettia's mom and her sister were right behind me in the courtroom.
I was relieved. It doesn't give you closure, though. None of it gives you closure.
The judge sentences Eric to 85 years to life in prison.
He don't need to be on the street. Justice needed to be served.
Hopefully Eric never gets out and never is in the position to do something like that to anybody else.
But even with Eric locked up for decades to come, Poinsettia's loved ones can never forget the...
There are places that look so ordinary, so peaceful, that it becomes almost impossible to imagine they could ever become part of one of the darkest chapters in criminal history. Along the California coastline, where morning fog rolls gently over the hills before surrendering to warm sunlight, life once moved with an effortless rhythm. College students hurried between lectures carrying stacks of books against their chests. Hitchhikers stood beside winding roads with hopeful smiles, believing that the next passing car would simply take them a little closer to home. Parents waited for weekend phone calls. Roommates expected familiar footsteps outside dormitory doors. Friends made plans for concerts, exams, birthdays, and futures they believed stretched endlessly ahead. Nothing about those days suggested that fear was quietly taking shape. In the early 1970s, California represented possibility. It was a place where young people came searching for education, independence, and new beginnings. The cultural optimism of the previous decade still lingered in the air. Campuses buzzed with debate, music drifted from open windows, and strangers often trusted one another more than they would today. Accepting a ride from someone driving in the same direction hardly seemed unusual. The roads connecting small towns and universities carried thousands of students every week, and most of them reached their destinations without ever thinking twice about the stranger behind the wheel. Then, little by little, something changed. A student would miss dinner. A roommate would report that someone never came back. Parents would wait beside the telephone longer than usual before uneasiness settled into panic. Police departments received missing person reports that, at first glance, appeared unrelated. Young women disappeared from different locations, on different days, under different circumstances. There were no dramatic scenes. No witnesses describing violent struggles. No obvious connection tying every case together. Only silence. Silence became the first clue. Every empty dorm room told the same quiet story. An unfinished assignment left on a desk. Clothes hanging neatly inside a closet. A coffee mug still sitting beside an open textbook. Beds that remained perfectly made because no one had returned to sleep in them. Lives paused in the middle of ordinary routines, as though someone had simply stepped outside for a moment. But they never came back. Communities searched desperately for explanations that made sense. Perhaps someone had decided to leave unexpectedly. Perhaps there had been an accident along one of the isolated highways. Perhaps they had chosen not to contact family for reasons only they understood. Hope has a remarkable way of surviving long after logic begins to fade. Search parties walked wooded trails. Volunteers examined ravines and beaches. Friends retraced familiar routes over and over again, convincing themselves that the next corner might finally reveal the answer everyone wanted. Instead, questions multiplied. Every unanswered disappearance placed another invisible weight upon families already struggling against uncertainty. Mothers replayed their final conversations. Fathers wondered whether they had missed some warning hidden inside an ordinary goodbye. Brothers and sisters kept expecting the front door to open. It never did. As weeks became months, an unsettling realization slowly spread through California. These were no longer isolated tragedies. Whether anyone was prepared to admit it or not, something far more disturbing seemed to be unfolding. Somewhere, someone understood exactly why these young women had vanished. Everyone else was trying to catch up. The frightening truth about evil is that it rarely announces itself. It does not always wear an angry expression or hide inside abandoned buildings. Sometimes it smiles politely. Sometimes it speaks with surprising intelligence. Sometimes it appears so calm, so ordinary, that people instinctively lower their guard. The man at the center of this story did not resemble the terrifying monsters audiences often imagine. Standing well over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered and physically imposing, he certainly attracted attention. Yet those who spoke with him often remembered something else first. His voice remained measured. His conversations could be thoughtful. He laughed easily. He seemed capable of discussing books, psychology, current events, or everyday frustrations with remarkable confidence. To many people, he looked less like someone capable of unimaginable violence and more like someone who might help fix a flat tire on the side of the road. Appearances can become dangerous when they create certainty where none should exist. Long before investigators would connect his name to one of America's most infamous murder cases, there had already been warning signs scattered throughout his life. Some were noticed but misunderstood. Others were explained away. Still others simply disappeared beneath the comforting belief that treatment, time, or maturity had changed him. Those assumptions would prove devastating. Years later, psychologists, criminologists, detectives, and journalists would spend countless hours studying his interviews, searching for answers that might explain how someone capable of ordinary conversation could also commit extraordinary acts of violence. They examined his childhood, his family relationships, his intelligence, his personality, and every documented decision leading toward the crimes that shocked the nation. Yet even after decades of analysis, one uncomfortable reality remains. Understanding is not the same as explaining. No psychological profile can restore a life that has been taken. No diagnosis can erase grief. No interview can answer the question that echoes through every true crime story. Why them? Behind every newspaper headline stood a real person whose future simply stopped. Young women with ambitions, friendships, insecurities, favorite songs, unfinished dreams, and families who loved them became known to the public only because they crossed paths with the wrong stranger at the wrong moment. That is perhaps the greatest tragedy of all. History often remembers the name of the offender more easily than the names of those whose lives were stolen. This story refuses to accept that imbalance. Before examining investigations, courtrooms, and psychological evaluations, it asks us to remember something profoundly simple. Every missing poster represented someone whose absence created a permanent space that could never again be filled. Every family carried unanswered questions into every holiday, every birthday, and every ordinary afternoon that followed. The fear that spread across California did not begin with headlines. It began with empty chairs at dinner tables. It began with parents staring through living room windows long after sunset. It began with friends refusing to believe that someone so dependable would disappear without saying goodbye. It began with hope. And then, one by one, hope collided with reality. The investigation that followed would expose failures, coincidences, extraordinary detective work, and the chilling patience of a man who had spent years learning how to appear harmless. It would reveal uncomfortable truths about trust, institutional mistakes, and the limits of understanding human violence. It would also force investigators to confront an unsettling possibility. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone believes they already understand. This is not merely the story of a serial killer. It is the story of lives interrupted, warnings overlooked, families forever changed, and a community that slowly realized evil had been hiding in plain sight all along. The road toward that realization did not begin with flashing police lights or dramatic arrests. It began quietly, almost invisibly, with ordinary mornings that seemed no different from any other. Until they were. There was a time when California felt like a promise. To millions of Americans, the state represented freedom in its purest form. The coastline stretched for hundreds of miles beneath bright skies, college campuses welcomed students from every corner of the country, and the spirit of the late 1960s still lingered in conversations about opportunity, self-discovery, and the future. It was a place where young adults believed they could reinvent themselves simply by arriving with a suitcase, a notebook, and enough determination to begin again. Along the Central Coast, the city of Santa Cruz reflected that optimism. It was neither as crowded as Los Angeles nor as fast-paced as San Francisco. Instead, it carried a quieter rhythm. Redwood forests bordered winding highways. Ocean fog drifted inland during the early hours before the afternoon sun revealed rolling hills and neighborhoods where people knew their neighbors. It was the kind of place where life appeared manageable, where families expected children to come home for dinner and students believed the biggest challenge waiting for them was the next examination. The University of California, Santa Cruz, had become one of the state's most distinctive campuses. Its buildings blended into wooded landscapes rather than towering over them. Walking paths disappeared beneath towering trees. Deer occasionally wandered across open fields. Students spent afternoons debating philosophy on grassy hillsides or carrying books between lectures while the sound of the Pacific Ocean remained only a short drive away. For many young women arriving on campus, this was the first taste of independence. Letters home spoke of difficult classes, new friendships, shared apartments, and plans for careers that seemed both ambitious and attainable. Parents worried, as parents always do, but they also trusted that their daughters were surrounded by educators, classmates, and communities that valued learning and personal growth. Travel itself looked different during the early 1970s. Owning a reliable car was not always possible for students, and public transportation between smaller communities could be limited. Hitchhiking was common enough that many people barely questioned it. A cardboard sign, a raised thumb, and a patient wait beside the road often resulted in a ride from someone headed in the same direction. Today, that image immediately raises concern. At the time, many people viewed it as ordinary. Certainly, there were stories warning against trusting strangers, but those stories rarely shaped everyday decisions. Countless rides ended with a simple thank you before passengers continued on their way. Communities functioned on assumptions that now seem almost unimaginable, that most people meant well, that kindness outweighed danger, and that obvious threats would reveal themselves before harm could occur. Those assumptions created an environment where trust became routine. That trust would eventually be exploited. As months passed, families continued living familiar routines. Mothers prepared weekend meals while expecting children to visit after classes. Fathers planned phone calls to discuss grades, summer jobs, or upcoming holidays. Younger siblings admired older sisters who had left home to pursue education, imagining they might follow the same path one day. The future appeared remarkably ordinary. Ordinary, however, can disappear quietly. When a student failed to return to her residence, those closest to her often searched for explanations that fit the person they knew. Perhaps she had accepted an unexpected invitation. Perhaps she had stayed with friends. Perhaps she had decided to travel without notifying anyone. In an era before mobile phones, immediate communication simply did not exist. Hours could pass before concern became genuine alarm. By then, valuable time had often disappeared alongside unanswered questions. Law enforcement agencies also faced challenges that would be difficult to imagine today. Missing person reports were frequently handled by local departments with limited ability to compare cases across jurisdictions. Information traveled through paperwork, telephone calls, and physical records rather than digital databases. Detectives relied heavily on interviews, witness recollections, and painstaking coordination between agencies that did not always communicate efficiently. What looked like isolated disappearances often remained isolated on paper. Patterns emerged slowly. Too slowly. Communities responded in different ways. Some parents insisted their children avoid traveling alone after dark. Others encouraged them to stop hitchhiking altogether. Campus administrators discussed safety measures while trying to balance caution with the desire to avoid creating unnecessary fear. Yet uncertainty is difficult to manage because it offers no clear enemy. There was no warning that everyone recognized. No single location people could avoid. No unmistakable description broadcast across every newspaper. Instead, anxiety spread through absence. Friends noticed empty seats during lectures. Professors quietly asked whether anyone had heard from a missing student. Dormitory bulletin boards displayed photographs beside handwritten requests for information. Telephone calls home became more frequent, not because anything had happened, but because reassurance suddenly felt more valuable than before. Every unanswered disappearance subtly changed behavior. Students who once walked alone after evening classes began traveling together. Parents requested more frequent letters. Neighbors paid closer attention to unfamiliar vehicles. Small habits shifted almost without anyone realizing it. The landscape itself remained beautiful. Morning sunlight still reached the cliffs overlooking the Pacific. Waves continued breaking against rocky shores with complete indifference to human tragedy. Birds crossed the forests exactly as they had the year before. Nature offered no indication that anything extraordinary had changed. Only people carried that knowledge. Years later, investigators, historians, and criminologists would look back on this period as a moment when several vulnerabilities overlapped. Social trust remained exceptionally high. Investigative technology was limited by modern standards. Communication between agencies was slower than many people realized. Missing adults were sometimes assumed to have left voluntarily, delaying the urgency with which some cases were approached. None of those factors caused the crimes. Together, however, they created circumstances in which a series of disappearances could remain disconnected longer than they should have. Looking back with the benefit of hindsight makes the warning signs appear clearer than they were for those living through them. For the families involved, there was no complete picture. Only fragments. A missed phone call. A car left behind. A lecture unattended. A promise to visit home that suddenly went unfulfilled. Every fragment represented someone whose story deserved to continue. Instead, those stories became intertwined with one of the most studied criminal investigations in American history. Yet before investigators assembled timelines, before psychologists attempted to understand motives, and before courtrooms examined evidence, there existed only ordinary lives unfolding against the backdrop of an extraordinary landscape. Students laughed with friends in campus cafes. Parents mailed care packages. Professors graded essays. Roommates discussed weekend plans. Life continued because no one could yet see the shape of the danger moving quietly through familiar roads. The tragedy that followed would eventually reshape conversations about personal safety, investigative cooperation, and the importance of recognizing patterns before they become impossible to ignore. It would influence criminal profiling, encourage changes in investigative practices, and leave a lasting mark on the communities that experienced it firsthand. But those lessons belonged to the future. For now, California still looked like a place where dreams began. No one standing beside a quiet highway, waiting for a ride beneath the afternoon sun, could have imagined that history was already moving toward one of its darkest chapters. And for the families who would soon find themselves searching for answers, there was still time to believe that tomorrow would arrive just like every day before it. It was in that fragile space between confidence and uncertainty that the story truly began. Long before their names appeared in police files, newspaper headlines, or court records, they were simply daughters. They were the voices that called home on Sunday evenings, promising they were eating well even when money was tight. They were the students who stayed awake past midnight finishing assignments, convinced that one more hour of studying might make the difference between an average grade and an excellent one. They laughed with roommates, borrowed sweaters from friends, complained about difficult professors, and imagined futures that seemed impossibly close. It is easy, decades later, to remember this case only by the name of the man responsible for so much suffering. History often does that. It compresses many lives into a single notorious story. But each victim carried an entire world that cannot be measured by the circumstances of her death. One dreamed of building a career that would help others. Another had spoken excitedly about upcoming classes and the independence that college offered. Some had only recently settled into campus life, still learning the quickest routes between lecture halls and libraries. Others had begun to feel that Santa Cruz was becoming home, a place where strangers slowly became lifelong friends. Their families remembered ordinary details far more vividly than any headline ever could. A favorite meal. A habit of humming while studying. The way one daughter always packed too many books for a weekend trip. The birthday cards carefully saved in a drawer. The small arguments that every family experiences, followed by apologies and laughter that seemed too ordinary to remember until those moments became impossible to recreate. Parents watched their children leave for college believing they were witnessing the beginning of adulthood. There were tears at train stations, hugs in parking lots, reminders to call home, and quiet drives back after moving day. Like countless families across the United States, they accepted that growing up meant letting go a little at a time. None of them imagined that uncertainty would replace distance. When someone failed to return as expected, concern rarely arrived all at once. At first, it came in the form of practical explanations. Perhaps she had stayed with a friend. Perhaps she had missed a scheduled phone call. Perhaps she had decided to spend another day on campus before traveling home. Each explanation felt reasonable because it reflected the person they knew, a young adult living an increasingly independent life. As hours turned into days, reassurance became more difficult to find. Friends retraced familiar routines, asking the same questions repeatedly. Had anyone seen her after class? Did she mention changing her plans? Was she meeting someone? Every conversation seemed to produce another possibility but no certainty. Dormitory rooms became frozen snapshots of interrupted lives. Open notebooks rested on desks beside unfinished assignments. Clothes remained folded exactly as they had been left. Library books sat waiting to be returned. Calendars still displayed appointments that would never be kept. Those quiet spaces often spoke louder than words. For investigators, every missing person case demanded careful attention to timelines and evidence. For families, however, time was experienced differently. Every passing day stretched hope thinner without completely breaking it. As long as there were no definitive answers, many held on to the belief that their loved one would walk through the front door, embarrassed for causing so much worry. Hope persisted because love does. The disappearances also affected classmates in ways that were difficult to measure. Campus life changed almost imperceptibly at first. Friends who had once walked alone after evening classes began waiting for one another. Study groups ended earlier. Weekend trips were discussed more carefully. Parents calling from hundreds of miles away asked more questions than they had before. Conversations that once centered on exams and careers gradually included another subject: safety. The university remained a place of learning, but it was no longer untouched by uncertainty. Faculty members noticed empty seats that remained empty week after week. Administrators balanced the need to inform students with the responsibility to avoid creating unnecessary panic before facts were established. Local communities organized searches, distributed photographs, and hoped that someone, somewhere, had seen something that could lead to answers. The emotional burden extended far beyond immediate families. Neighbors volunteered their time. Friends answered the same difficult questions from investigators over and over, searching their memories for details that might suddenly become important. Professors wrote letters of support. Religious leaders opened their doors to families who found themselves confronting an uncertainty unlike any they had known before. Years later, many of those closest to the victims would remember not only the fear but also the extraordinary kindness shown by ordinary people. Meals appeared on doorsteps. Complete strangers joined organized searches. Communities discovered that compassion often grows strongest during moments of profound loss. Yet compassion could not erase absence. Every milestone that followed carried an empty place. Graduations, family celebrations, holidays, wedding anniversaries. The arrival of grandchildren whom some parents had once imagined introducing to their daughters. Loss does not end when a trial concludes. It continues quietly through years measured not by headlines but by birthdays, family photographs, and conversations that always seem to include someone who should still be there. For historians and criminologists, this case is often discussed because of its investigative significance and its influence on criminal psychology. Those are important subjects. They helped shape future investigative practices and improved understanding of violent offenders. But before this became a case study, it was a human tragedy. The victims were never symbols. They were individuals whose lives reflected the ordinary hopes shared by countless young people beginning adulthood. They expected challenges, certainly, but those challenges involved examinations, careers, relationships, and discovering who they wanted to become. Their futures deserved the chance to unfold naturally. Remembering them in that light changes the way this story is told. Instead of viewing them only through the lens of violence, we recognize their ambitions, their friendships, their families, and the communities that continue to remember them. Their stories remind us that every victim leaves behind a network of people whose lives are also permanently altered. As investigators worked to understand what connected the disappearances, families continued waiting for answers that no family should ever have to seek. The search was no longer only for missing individuals. It had become a search for truth, accountability, and the hope that no other family would experience the same uncertainty. That search would soon uncover evidence pointing toward a pattern far more troubling than anyone had first imagined, transforming a series of seemingly unrelated disappearances into one of the most consequential homicide investigations in California's history. The first disappearance did not immediately feel like the beginning of a larger story. In communities where students frequently traveled between campuses, visited friends without notice, or spent weekends away from home, an unexpected absence could sometimes be explained by ordinary circumstances. Families hoped there had been a misunderstanding. Friends assumed plans had changed. Investigators, working with the information available at the time, treated each report as an individual case that deserved careful attention but did not yet appear connected to anything broader. That uncertainty was one of the most difficult burdens for everyone involved. Without clear evidence, there was no obvious direction. Every possibility remained open. A delayed journey, an accident along a rural highway, a voluntary decision to leave for a few days, each explanation seemed plausible enough to prevent immediate conclusions. The lack of certainty offered hope, but it also delayed the realization that something far more serious might be unfolding. As additional reports reached law enforcement, subtle similarities began to emerge. The individuals who had disappeared shared common characteristics. Many were young women beginning adulthood, balancing classes, work, friendships, and the responsibilities that came with living independently. Several had last been seen traveling through areas where hitchhiking remained common, an everyday practice that reflected the culture of the time rather than unusual risk-taking. To students with limited transportation options, accepting a ride often seemed like a practical decision rather than a dangerous one. Investigators understood that coincidences could happen. College towns naturally brought together people of similar ages following similar routines. Similarity alone was not enough to conclude that the cases were connected. Yet the growing number of unanswered disappearances became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Within university communities, conversations slowly changed. Campus bulletin boards displayed missing person notices beside announcements for student clubs and academic events. The contrast was striking. One flyer advertised a weekend concert while another asked whether anyone had seen a student who had failed to return home. Everyday life continued, but anxiety had quietly become part of it. Parents who had once encouraged independence began asking more detailed questions during telephone calls. Who are you walking home with? How are you getting back from class? Will someone know where you are if your plans change? Questions that had once sounded overly cautious now felt entirely reasonable. Students adapted in their own ways. Friends waited for one another after evening lectures. Carpools became more common. Some chose longer routes simply because they were better lit or busier. Others stopped hitchhiking altogether, despite how common the practice had been only months earlier. Fear rarely arrives as a single dramatic moment. More often, it appears gradually, reshaping ordinary decisions until people can no longer remember exactly when they started behaving differently. Local newspapers reflected that shift in mood. Early articles focused on individual missing person reports, encouraging readers to contact authorities if they possessed relevant information. As more families came forward, coverage broadened. Journalists began asking whether the disappearances might be related. Reporters interviewed neighbors, university officials, and law enforcement representatives, all of whom faced the same challenge, explaining a situation that remained deeply uncertain. Investigators worked carefully to separate speculation from evidence. Rumors spread quickly through campuses and neighborhoods. Some claimed a dangerous drifter was traveling along the coast. Others suggested organized criminal activity despite little evidence supporting those theories. Every new rumor created additional work for detectives, who had to evaluate tips while remaining focused on facts that could withstand careful scrutiny. This balance was never easy. The emotional pressure surrounding missing person investigations can encourage people to search for immediate answers, but successful investigations often depend upon patience, documentation, and verification. Detectives revisited timelines repeatedly, comparing witness statements, travel routes, and reported sightings. They looked for patterns not because they expected every detail to match, but because meaningful connections often emerge only after careful comparison. The landscape itself complicated those efforts. California's Central Coast contains forests, winding roads, steep hillsides, and remote areas that can be difficult to search thoroughly. Volunteers joined law enforcement officers in organized efforts covering large stretches of terrain. Search teams walked trails, examined areas near highways, and responded whenever new information suggested another location deserved attention. Each search represented more than an investigative task. For families, every organized effort carried renewed hope that answers, whatever they might be, were finally within reach. Waiting beside telephones became an exhausting routine. Every unexpected knock at the door caused hearts to race before reality settled in once again. Meanwhile, university administrators faced difficult decisions of their own. Providing accurate information without creating unnecessary panic required careful judgment. Students deserved to understand potential risks, yet officials also recognized that incomplete information could lead to confusion and fear. Safety reminders became more visible. Campus communities encouraged students to travel together whenever possible and remain aware of their surroundings. Those recommendations reflected caution rather than certainty. No one yet understood the full scope of what investigators were confronting. Years later, many detectives involved in serial crime investigations would emphasize how difficult it can be to recognize patterns while events are still unfolding. Looking backward often creates the illusion that warning signs were obvious from the beginning. In reality, each disappearance arrived as its own tragedy, investigated by professionals working within the limitations of the information available at that moment. Technology also shaped those limitations. Modern investigators benefit from digital databases capable of rapidly comparing reports across jurisdictions, identifying shared characteristics, and distributing information almost instantly. During the early 1970s, communication depended far more heavily upon telephone calls, written records, photographs, and personal coordination between agencies. Dedicated investigators worked tirelessly, but the tools available to them were fundamentally different from those used today. As weeks became months, however, one conclusion became increasingly difficult to avoid. The disappearances were not simply isolated incidents. Whether connected directly or indirectly, they revealed a level of risk that communities had not previously recognized. Public confidence changed noticeably. Parents delayed allowing younger children to travel alone. Businesses discussed safety with employees. Residents who had never questioned unfamiliar vehicles parked near neighborhoods suddenly paid closer attention. Communities often remember the precise moment when daily routines begin to feel different. For some, it was seeing another missing person poster appear where yesterday there had been none. For others, it was hearing neighbors discuss safety instead of weekend plans. For many families, it was realizing that concern had quietly become part of ordinary life. Investigators remained committed to identifying whoever or whatever lay behind the disappearances. Every interview, every document, every reported sighting became another piece of an incomplete puzzle. Progress was measured not through dramatic breakthroughs but through countless hours of careful, methodical work performed by people determined to provide answers despite uncertainty. The emotional cost of that uncertainty continued growing. Families balanced hope against realism without knowing where one ended and the other began. Friends attempted to support one another while confronting fears they had never expected to experience during what should have been some of the most exciting years of their lives. Entire communities discovered how quickly confidence could give way to vigilance. The questions became more urgent with each passing week. Who was responsible? How had these young women disappeared without immediate explanation? Most importantly, could it happen again? Those questions would soon drive investigators toward one of the most significant turning points in the case. As information accumulated and evidence began to converge, what had once appeared to be separate mysteries slowly transformed into a single investigation, one that would challenge assumptions, expose weaknesses in existing investigative systems, and ultimately reshape how law enforcement approached linked violent crimes for years to come. The most difficult moments in any investigation are often not the moments when answers are found. They are the moments before. The long stretches of uncertainty when families, investigators, and communities are forced to live between what they fear and what they know. In the early stages of the California disappearances connected to the case of Edmund Kemper, there was no single event that immediately revealed the full picture. Instead, understanding came slowly, through fragments of information that gradually began to form a disturbing pattern. For the families waiting at home, the first discovery was not evidence. It was absence. A bedroom that remained unchanged. A phone that never rang. A calendar filled with plans that would never happen. These small details became painful reminders that something had interrupted a life that had once followed a predictable rhythm. Investigators could document timelines and collect statements, but families experienced the investigation through personal memories. They remembered conversations, habits, and moments that seemed insignificant until they became the final pieces of a story they never wanted to tell. The search for answers required patience. In the early 1970s, missing person investigations depended heavily on communication between local agencies, witness interviews, physical records, and the careful comparison of details. There was no instant system connecting every report across the state. Information moved through phone calls, paperwork, and meetings between investigators who were often handling multiple cases at the same time. This meant that patterns could remain hidden longer than anyone wanted. A disappearance in one area might appear unrelated to another disappearance several miles away. Different families might report different circumstances. Different departments might collect different pieces of information. Only when those pieces were placed together did the possibility of a larger connection begin to emerge. The role of investigators during this period was not simply to find a suspect. It was to understand what had happened. That required reconstructing the final known movements of each missing person. Detectives spoke with friends, classmates, relatives, and anyone who might have encountered them during their last known hours. They examined routines, locations, and timelines. Every detail mattered because even the smallest piece of information could change the direction of an investigation. A conversation remembered months later. A vehicle description. A location mentioned casually in passing. A detail that seemed unimportant at the time but gained significance when viewed alongside other evidence. Investigations are often built from these moments. Not dramatic revelations, but careful work. As concern increased, the community began to participate more actively. Volunteers assisted with searches and helped distribute information. Photographs of missing young women appeared in public spaces, transforming private family tragedies into a shared community concern. Behind every photograph was a person. Not a case number. Not an investigation file. A person. The public often encounters true crime stories after the conclusion, when the mystery has already been solved and the outcome is known. But those living through the investigation did not have that knowledge. They faced each day without knowing whether the next phone call would bring relief or devastating news. That uncertainty shaped everything. Parents tried to remain hopeful while preparing themselves for possibilities they never wanted to consider. Friends struggled with memories of ordinary conversations that suddenly carried enormous emotional weight. Communities attempted to protect one another while searching for a sense of normal life. Meanwhile, investigators faced a difficult question. Were these events connected, or were they separate tragedies occurring at the same time? The answer would determine everything that followed. If the cases were unrelated, detectives needed to pursue individual explanations. If they were connected, then the investigation required a broader approach involving cooperation, shared information, and a deeper examination of possible links. The challenge was that patterns are often easiest to recognize after they are complete. While events are unfolding, investigators do not have the luxury of hindsight. They must work with incomplete information. They must question assumptions. They must consider multiple possibilities without becoming trapped by any single theory. This careful process eventually brought attention to similarities that could no longer be ignored. The disappearances were beginning to be viewed not as isolated incidents but as part of a larger and more troubling situation affecting the region. The discovery was not one piece of evidence. It was the realization that many separate questions might have the same answer. That realization changed the nature of the investigation. The focus shifted from individual searches toward identifying connections. Investigators began examining broader timelines, looking more closely at locations, relationships, and opportunities. The goal was no longer only to determine what happened in one case, but to understand whether multiple cases shared a common source. For the community, this shift brought both fear and a strange sense of clarity. Fear, because the possibility of a continuing threat became harder to dismiss. Clarity, because recognizing a pattern meant investigators finally had a direction. The road ahead would still be difficult. There would be uncertainty, competing theories, and many unanswered questions before the investigation reached its conclusion. But the silence that had surrounded the disappearances was beginning to break. Pieces were moving into place. The search for truth had entered a new phase, one where investigators would have to follow the evidence carefully, separate fact from speculation, and uncover how a series of tragedies had become connected. And somewhere within those connections was the information that would eventually change everything. As investigators continued piecing together the missing person reports, the nature of the case began to change. What had first appeared to be a collection of separate tragedies was becoming something much more complex. The challenge was no longer simply finding individuals who had disappeared. It was understanding whether there was a larger pattern hidden beneath the surface. Every investigation begins with uncertainty. Detectives rarely receive a complete story. They receive fragments. A conversation. A timeline. A witness statement. A location. A memory that may have seemed insignificant at the time but later becomes important. The work requires patience because every detail must be examined carefully. A mistaken assumption can send an investigation in the wrong direction, while a small overlooked fact can become the key to understanding what happened. In the case of the young women who disappeared around the Santa Cruz area, investigators were forced to work through a difficult reality. There was no immediate answer waiting for them. There was no single witness who could explain everything. There was no obvious connection visible from the beginning. Instead, they had to build the picture piece by piece. The investigators began reviewing information that had previously existed in separate files. Names, dates, locations, and circumstances were compared more closely. They searched for similarities not because every similarity proved a connection, but because patterns often reveal themselves through repetition. This process required cooperation between different law enforcement agencies. Local departments had their own responsibilities and their own information. Bringing those details together became essential. A report that seemed limited to one community could become significant when placed beside another report from a nearby area. The investigation became a process of connecting human experiences. Behind every document was a person. Behind every timeline was a family waiting for answers. The evidence was not merely paperwork. It represented moments from real lives, the last known movements of individuals who had plans, relationships, and futures ahead of them. As the investigation developed, authorities also had to manage public concern. Communities wanted information, but investigators had to be careful. Releasing unconfirmed details could create panic, damage the investigation, or lead to inaccurate rumors spreading faster than facts. The relationship between law enforcement and the public became increasingly important. Residents provided information. Witnesses came forward. Community members shared observations that might otherwise have remained unknown. Many of these contributions were small, but investigations are often strengthened by hundreds of small pieces rather than one dramatic discovery. At the same time, detectives faced the difficult task of considering multiple possibilities. A missing person case can involve many explanations. People may leave voluntarily, experience accidents, become victims of unrelated crimes, or encounter circumstances no one anticipated. Investigators must examine each possibility while avoiding conclusions based only on emotion or fear. The pressure was intense because time mattered. Families wanted answers immediately. Communities wanted reassurance. Investigators wanted certainty. But certainty cannot be forced. It must be built. As more information accumulated, investigators began to understand that the situation required a broader perspective. The question was no longer only what happened to one person at one moment. The question became whether a series of events shared a common explanation. That shift represented one of the most important moments in the investigation. A collection of unanswered questions was becoming a single investigation. The focus moved toward understanding relationships between events rather than examining each event separately. Investigators looked for recurring circumstances, possible connections, and information that could explain how these disappearances occurred. For families, this development carried complicated emotions. On one hand, recognizing a pattern meant that their loved ones' cases were receiving greater attention. There was renewed hope that answers might finally come. On the other hand, the possibility that multiple families had experienced related tragedies brought a painful realization: the situation might be more serious than anyone had first imagined. Hope and fear existed side by side. That is often the reality of major investigations. Progress does not always bring comfort immediately. Sometimes learning more creates even more difficult questions. The community around Santa Cruz began to understand that the issue was not only about individual safety. It was also about how society identifies danger, how institutions respond to warning signs, and how quickly information can be shared when lives may be at risk. The investigation would later become significant not only because of the crimes themselves, but because of what it revealed about the challenges faced by law enforcement during that era. Investigators were working before many of the modern tools now considered essential. There were no advanced databases instantly comparing cases across regions. There were no digital systems organizing information in seconds. Much of the work depended on human effort, memory, communication, and determination. Every interview required time. Every record required review. Every possible lead required careful evaluation. Behind the eventual headlines was a long process of ordinary investigative work performed under extraordinary circumstances. The breakthrough would not come from one simple answer appearing overnight. It would come through persistence, the gradual accumulation of information until the truth became impossible to ignore. The families who had spent months searching for explanations were still waiting. The investigators who had spent countless hours reviewing evidence were still working. And the communities affected by the disappearances were still trying to understand how something so devastating could have happened in a place that once felt so safe. The investigation had reached a turning point. The questions were becoming clearer. The connections were becoming stronger. And the search for answers was moving closer to the person who would eventually become central to the case, not through speculation, but through evidence, persistence, and the careful work of those determined to uncover the truth. Investigations often reach their most important moments quietly. There is rarely a single dramatic instant when every question is answered and every piece of the puzzle suddenly falls into place. More often, progress comes through long hours of careful work, through investigators comparing information repeatedly, through small details that slowly begin to carry greater meaning. For the families affected by the disappearances, this process was painfully slow. Every day without answers created another layer of uncertainty. The world continued moving around them, but their lives remained suspended between hope and fear. They searched for explanations in memories, replaying conversations, and revisiting the last moments they had shared with their loved ones. Investigators understood the urgency behind those emotions, but they also understood the responsibility of following evidence rather than assumptions. The truth had to be built carefully. By this stage, authorities were no longer looking at individual reports as completely separate events. Information from different cases was being reviewed together. Timelines were compared. Statements were examined again. Details that once appeared ordinary were reconsidered in the context of a larger investigation. This was one of the most important changes in direction. The investigation was no longer simply asking, "What happened?" It was asking, What connects these events? That question transformed the work. Detectives began examining broader circumstances surrounding the disappearances. They looked at locations, opportunities, and patterns of contact. They studied how victims had entered situations where they became vulnerable and considered what circumstances allowed those situations to occur. The goal was not to create fear. The goal was understanding. Understanding why certain warning signs had not been recognized earlier. Understanding how information could be shared more effectively. Understanding how future investigations could respond faster. At the same time, the public conversation surrounding safety began to change. Practices that had once been considered normal were being reconsidered. Students, families, and communities began discussing personal safety in ways they had rarely done before. For many people, this was an uncomfortable adjustment. Trust had always been a foundation of everyday life. Helping strangers, accepting assistance, and believing that most people were simply trying to go about their lives were values deeply rooted in society. The challenge was learning how to maintain compassion while also recognizing the importance of awareness. The investigation also revealed the difficulty of solving cases in an era before modern technology transformed law enforcement. Today, investigators can compare records, analyze digital information, and share updates almost instantly. In the early 1970s, many of those resources did not exist. Detectives relied on dedication, communication, and traditional investigative methods. They spent hours conducting interviews. They reviewed documents by hand. They followed leads that sometimes ended without answers. They returned to information repeatedly, knowing that a detail overlooked one day might become important later. This type of work rarely receives attention because it happens away from public view. There are no dramatic moments attached to every interview or every document review. Yet these routine actions often determine whether an investigation succeeds. Behind every major case are countless hours of careful, patient effort. As the investigation continued, the relationship between law enforcement and the community became increasingly important. Residents provided information. Friends and classmates shared memories. People who might once have ignored unusual circumstances became more willing to report concerns. The community itself became part of the search for answers. But even as progress was being made, the emotional weight remained. Finding connections between cases meant acknowledging that multiple families had experienced related tragedies. It meant accepting that the uncertainty they had endured was not temporary confusion but part of a much larger reality. For those families, justice was never only about identifying a person responsible. It was about recognizing the lives that had been lost. It was about ensuring that their loved ones were remembered as complete human beings rather than names attached to a criminal investigation. It was about finding some sense of accountability after a period defined by unanswered questions. The investigation moved forward through evidence, cooperation, and persistence. The pieces were no longer scattered in isolation. They were beginning to form a clearer picture. But clarity did not arrive without cost. Every discovery brought investigators closer to the truth while also forcing families and communities to confront painful realities they had hoped would never exist. The next stage of the case would depend on one of the most important elements in any criminal investigation: the ability to connect evidence with responsibility. The search was no longer only about understanding what had happened. It was about determining who would be held accountable. The hardest part of any major investigation is often the period when investigators know something is wrong, but they do not yet know exactly what they are looking for. By the time authorities began to recognize connections between several disappearances in the Santa Cruz area, the investigation had entered a new and more complicated stage. The question was no longer limited to individual cases. Detectives were now facing a broader challenge: understanding whether a larger pattern existed and determining what evidence could prove that connection. Investigations are built on facts, not fear. Although the public often imagines criminal investigations as a sequence of dramatic discoveries, the reality is usually much slower. Detectives spend countless hours reviewing documents, speaking with witnesses, checking timelines, and revisiting information that may have seemed insignificant when it was first collected. Every detail must be tested. Every assumption must be questioned. Every possible explanation must be considered. During this period, investigators worked through a difficult balance. They needed to act quickly because lives and answers depended on their progress, but they also needed to remain careful. A wrong conclusion could damage an investigation and create additional suffering for families already experiencing unimaginable uncertainty. The missing person cases demanded a level of coordination that was challenging during that era. Different agencies often maintained separate records and followed their own procedures. Sharing information required communication between departments, something that could take valuable time compared with the rapid information systems available to investigators today. A detail known by one department might not immediately be known by another. A witness statement recorded in one location might become important only after being compared with information from another case. A small similarity between two reports could change the entire direction of an investigation. This process required persistence. Detectives returned to interviews and evidence repeatedly. They spoke with people who knew the victims, trying to understand their routines, their friendships, and the circumstances surrounding their last known movements. These conversations were not simply information gathering. They were attempts to reconstruct pieces of lives that had suddenly been interrupted. Friends described personalities, habits, and dreams. Families shared memories that extended far beyond the circumstances of the investigation. Each conversation reminded investigators that behind every file was a person who had mattered deeply to others. That perspective shaped the work. A case file may contain dates and locations, but it represents a human story. As investigators continued their efforts, they also faced another challenge: separating reliable information from speculation. High-profile cases often attract rumors. Fear can cause communities to search for simple explanations, even when the evidence does not support them. Stories spread quickly, sometimes creating confusion and making investigative work more difficult. Authorities had to carefully evaluate every piece of information. A useful lead could come from an unexpected source, but every claim required verification. The investigation depended on discipline. At the same time, the community itself was changing. The sense of safety that many residents had previously taken for granted was replaced by increased awareness. People began paying closer attention to their surroundings. Families spoke more openly about safety. Students adjusted routines that had once seemed completely normal. The disappearance cases had changed the emotional landscape of the region. Places that had once represented freedom and independence now carried memories of uncertainty. Roads, campuses, and familiar neighborhoods became associated with questions that had not yet been answered. For investigators, however, the focus remained the same: evidence. They examined patterns of opportunity, circumstances surrounding the disappearances, and information that could establish connections between events. They looked beyond individual incidents and attempted to understand the broader circumstances that allowed the crimes to occur. This approach reflected a major principle of modern investigation: understanding the environment around a crime can be just as important as identifying individual pieces of evidence. The investigation was not only about finding a person responsible. It was about understanding what happened, how it happened, and how future tragedies might be prevented. As months passed, pressure increased. Families needed answers. The public wanted reassurance. Investigators knew that every unanswered question represented another person waiting for closure. But progress in complex investigations rarely follows a straight path. There were possibilities that had to be explored and abandoned. There were theories that appeared promising but did not lead anywhere. There were moments when investigators had to accept that a particular direction was not supported by evidence and begin again. This is the reality of investigative work. Success often comes not only from finding the right answers, but from having the patience to eliminate the wrong ones. Slowly, the investigation continued moving forward. The scattered pieces of information were becoming more organized. The connections between events were becoming clearer. What had once been a series of frightening uncertainties was beginning to take the shape of a case with identifiable patterns. Yet the most important questions remained unanswered. Who was responsible? How had the disappearances remained unsolved for so long? And what evidence would finally reveal the truth? The investigation was entering a critical phase. The work of detectives, the information provided by witnesses, and the careful examination of evidence would soon lead toward the breakthrough that changed the direction of the entire case. As the investigation continued, authorities faced a challenge that appears repeatedly in complex criminal cases. The truth was not hidden behind one single mystery, but behind many unanswered questions. Investigators were not working with a complete picture. They were working with fragments collected over time. Each interview, each report, and each piece of information added another small part to an increasingly complicated timeline. The task was to determine which details mattered. In any investigation, not every piece of information leads somewhere. Some possibilities must be examined and ruled out. Some statements require additional verification. Some assumptions that seem convincing at first eventually prove unreliable. This process can be frustrating for the public, especially when families are waiting for answers. From the outside, a case may appear simple: find the person responsible and bring them to justice. But behind that outcome are months or years of careful work, where investigators must build a chain of evidence strong enough to withstand scrutiny. The disappearance cases connected to the Santa Cruz area presented exactly that challenge. Investigators had to examine the circumstances surrounding each victim while also looking for connections between separate events. They reviewed timelines, spoke with people who had interacted with the victims, and considered the environments where the disappearances occurred. The focus was not only on what happened. It was also on why certain circumstances repeated. Why did these situations occur? What opportunities allowed them to happen? What information had been missed earlier? These questions shaped the direction of the investigation. During this period, cooperation became increasingly important. No single individual or department possessed every piece of information. Detectives needed to communicate across different areas, compare findings, and combine knowledge from multiple sources. The process reflected a reality of criminal investigations. Solving difficult cases often depends on collaboration. One officer may notice a detail another person overlooked. One interview may provide context for information collected elsewhere. One document may become meaningful only after it is connected with another record. Progress often comes from bringing separate pieces together. Technology limitations also influenced the investigation. Modern law enforcement benefits from advanced databases, digital communication systems, and tools that allow investigators to compare large amounts of information quickly. During the early 1970s, much of this work depended on personal coordination and manual review. Detectives spent long hours organizing information, making calls, reviewing statements, and following leads. The work required patience because answers were not always immediate. The investigation also existed under intense public attention. Communities wanted reassurance. Families wanted closure. Media coverage increased interest in the case, bringing both helpful information and additional challenges. Public attention can encourage witnesses to come forward, but it can also create rumors that investigators must carefully separate from verified facts. Maintaining accuracy became essential. A criminal investigation cannot be guided by the loudest theory. It must be guided by evidence. As investigators continued examining the available information, the case gradually became more focused. The number of possible explanations narrowed. Certain patterns became more difficult to ignore. The investigation moved from asking whether events were connected toward understanding the nature of those connections. This transition represented an important stage. The uncertainty was beginning to give way to direction. For the families affected, however, progress did not erase the pain of waiting. Even as investigators moved closer to answers, the emotional consequences remained permanent. Every development in the investigation carried complicated feelings: relief that information was emerging, but grief over what that information might reveal. Justice in cases like this is not only about identifying responsibility. It is also about acknowledging the lives affected. The victims were students, daughters, friends, and members of communities that continued to remember them. The investigation existed because their lives mattered and because their families deserved answers. As the case moved forward, investigators prepared for the next stage, transforming gathered information into evidence that could establish accountability. The path ahead would require careful decisions, reliable proof, and the ability to connect facts into a clear narrative. After months of uncertainty, the investigation was approaching a turning point. The questions that had remained unanswered for so long were finally beginning to move toward answers. As the investigation continued, authorities faced a challenge that appears repeatedly in complex criminal cases. The truth was not hidden behind one single mystery, but behind many unanswered questions. Investigators were not working with a complete picture. They were working with fragments collected over time. Each interview, each report, and each piece of information added another small part to an increasingly complicated timeline. The task was to determine which details mattered. In any investigation, not every piece of information leads somewhere. Some possibilities must be examined and ruled out. Some statements require additional verification. Some assumptions that seem convincing at first eventually prove unreliable. This process can be frustrating for the public, especially when families are waiting for answers. From the outside, a case may appear simple: find the person responsible and bring them to justice. But behind that outcome are months or years of careful work, where investigators must build a chain of evidence strong enough to withstand scrutiny. The disappearance cases connected to the Santa Cruz area presented exactly that challenge. Investigators had to examine the circumstances surrounding each victim while also looking for connections between separate events. They reviewed timelines, spoke with people who had interacted with the victims, and considered the environments where the disappearances occurred. The focus was not only on what happened. It was also on why certain circumstances repeated. Why did these situations occur? What opportunities allowed them to happen? What information had been missed earlier? These questions shaped the direction of the investigation. During this period, cooperation became increasingly important. No single individual or department possessed every piece of information. Detectives needed to communicate across different areas, compare findings, and combine knowledge from multiple sources. The process reflected a reality of criminal investigations. Solving difficult cases often depends on collaboration. One officer may notice a detail another person overlooked. One interview may provide context for information collected elsewhere. One document may become meaningful only after it is connected with another record. Progress often comes from bringing separate pieces together. Technology limitations also influenced the investigation. Modern law enforcement benefits from advanced databases, digital communication systems, and tools that allow investigators to compare large amounts of information quickly. During the early 1970s, much of this work depended on personal coordination and manual review. Detectives spent long hours organizing information, making calls, reviewing statements, and following leads. The work required patience because answers were not always immediate. The investigation also existed under intense public attention. Communities wanted reassurance. Families wanted closure. Media coverage increased interest in the case, bringing both helpful information and additional challenges. Public attention can encourage witnesses to come forward, but it can also create rumors that investigators must carefully separate from verified facts. Maintaining accuracy became essential. A criminal investigation cannot be guided by the loudest theory. It must be guided by evidence. As investigators continued examining the available information, the case gradually became more focused. The number of possible explanations narrowed. Certain patterns became more difficult to ignore. The investigation moved from asking whether events were connected toward understanding the nature of those connections. This transition represented an important stage. The uncertainty was beginning to give way to direction. For the families affected, however, progress did not erase the pain of waiting. Even as investigators moved closer to answers, the emotional consequences remained permanent. Every development in the investigation carried complicated feelings, relief that information was emerging, but grief over what that information might reveal. Justice in cases like this is not only about identifying responsibility. It is also about acknowledging the lives affected. The victims were students, daughters, friends, and members of communities that continued to remember them. The investigation existed because their lives mattered and because their families deserved answers. As the case moved forward, investigators prepared for the next stage, transforming gathered information into evidence that could establish accountability. The path ahead would require careful decisions, reliable proof, and the ability to connect facts into a clear narrative. After months of uncertainty, the investigation was approaching a turning point. The questions that had remained unanswered for so long were finally beginning to move toward answers. A major investigation is often remembered by its conclusion. The arrest. The courtroom. The final verdict. But for those who lived through it, the investigation itself was the longest and most difficult chapter. It was measured not in dramatic moments, but in days of uncertainty, unanswered questions, and the determination of people who refused to allow the victims' stories to disappear. As investigators continued working on the cases connected to the Santa Cruz area, they faced the challenge of turning scattered information into a clear understanding of events. Each report represented only a small part of a much larger picture. The responsibility of investigators was to examine those pieces carefully without allowing assumptions to replace evidence. The work required discipline. A possible connection had to be verified. A witness statement had to be examined. A timeline had to be reconstructed. Every conclusion needed support. This careful approach was especially important because the investigation involved real people whose families were already living through unimaginable uncertainty. A mistake could create false hope, spread unnecessary fear, or move the investigation away from the facts. For detectives, the process was often repetitive and demanding. They reviewed information that had already been collected, looking for details that might have been overlooked. They returned to conversations, records, and reports because sometimes the significance of a detail only becomes clear after additional information appears. A single statement could change the understanding of a case. A previously unnoticed connection could reshape the direction of an investigation. A detail that once seemed ordinary could become important when viewed from a different perspective. This is the nature of investigative work. The truth is often not discovered through one extraordinary moment, but through persistence. The investigation also highlighted the importance of communication between different agencies. Criminal cases that cross local boundaries can become complicated when information is separated between departments. Cooperation allows investigators to see the broader picture rather than only one part of it. The exchange of information became essential. A report from one location could provide context for another. A witness from one area could help explain circumstances elsewhere. A timeline created by one team could reveal patterns that were invisible before. The process was not always easy. Different agencies had different procedures, priorities, and resources. Coordinating efforts required patience and commitment from everyone involved. But complex cases often depend on exactly that kind of cooperation. At the same time, the public continued searching for answers. Communities wanted to understand what had happened and how such events could occur. Questions about safety, awareness, and responsibility became part of everyday conversations. The impact extended beyond the investigation itself. Students changed routines. Families reconsidered assumptions about safety. Communities became more aware of the importance of communication and paying attention to warning signs. However, investigators also understood that fear alone could not solve the case. Panic creates confusion. Evidence creates answers. Their task was to remain focused. As the investigation progressed, attention increasingly turned toward identifying connections that could be supported by facts. Investigators examined the available information from multiple perspectives, asking not only what was known but also what remained unknown. What information was missing? What questions had not yet been answered? What evidence could confirm or challenge existing theories? This process narrowed the possibilities. Slowly, the investigation moved away from uncertainty and toward a clearer understanding of the events. For families, this period remained incredibly difficult. Learning that progress was being made did not remove the pain of waiting. Every new development carried emotional consequences. The possibility of answers brought hope, but it also brought the fear of what those answers might reveal. Justice is complicated in cases involving irreversible loss. No investigation can return the lives that were taken. No verdict can undo the grief experienced by families. But uncovering the truth serves an important purpose. It recognizes what happened, establishes accountability, and ensures that victims are not forgotten. The investigation continued through persistence, cooperation, and attention to detail. The case was no longer defined only by unanswered questions. It was becoming a structured effort built around evidence and accountability. The next stage would depend on a critical moment that appears in many investigations, the point when accumulated information finally creates a path forward. After months of searching, reviewing, and questioning, investigators were approaching that moment. The breakthrough would not come from speculation. It would come from evidence. In many investigations, the breakthrough does not arrive as a sudden revelation. It is not always a single moment when every question disappears. More often, it is the result of countless hours of work finally beginning to connect. A conversation that once seemed ordinary becomes important. A piece of information that had been overlooked gains new meaning. Separate paths that once appeared unrelated begin to meet. For the investigators working on the California cases, that moment came after a long period defined by uncertainty. For months, families had waited for answers. Communities had adjusted to a new reality shaped by concern and caution. Detectives had followed leads, reviewed information, and examined possibilities while knowing that every decision carried consequences. The breakthrough began with information that changed the direction of the investigation. The significance was not only in what was discovered, but in how the discovery fit into the larger picture. Evidence that had once existed separately began to support a broader understanding of what had occurred. This is often the turning point in complex cases. The investigation moves from searching for possibilities toward establishing facts. Detectives could now focus their efforts more clearly. Instead of examining an endless number of potential explanations, they were able to follow a more defined path supported by information they could verify. The difference between suspicion and proof became increasingly important. A person can appear unusual. A theory can seem convincing. A rumor can spread quickly. But criminal investigations require something stronger. They require evidence that can be examined, challenged, and presented in a legal setting. The work that followed involved careful documentation and confirmation. Investigators had to build a complete picture rather than rely on assumptions. Every connection needed support. Every conclusion needed a foundation. This process required cooperation among multiple people. Detectives, analysts, witnesses, legal professionals, community members who provided information. Each person contributed a piece of a much larger effort. Behind the eventual outcome of the investigation were many individuals whose names would never appear in headlines. They were the people who organized records, reviewed statements, followed procedures, and continued working even when progress seemed slow. Their efforts represented an important reality of justice. Major cases are rarely solved by one person or one moment. They are solved through persistence. For the families of the victims, the developing breakthrough brought complicated emotions. Answers were finally becoming possible. But answers in cases like this are painful because they confirm what families had spent so long hoping was not true. The investigation was moving closer to accountability, but it was also moving closer to confronting the full extent of the loss. The victims remained at the center of the case. Every investigative step existed because people had lost their lives and because their families deserved to know what happened. The purpose of uncovering the truth was not simply to complete an investigation. It was to acknowledge the value of those lives and ensure their stories were remembered beyond the circumstances of their deaths. As evidence continued to accumulate, investigators prepared for the next challenge, presenting what they had discovered in a way that could meet the standards of the justice system. A breakthrough in an investigation is only the beginning. The information must be tested. The evidence must be reviewed. The facts must be presented clearly. The legal process demands more than certainty among investigators. It requires proof that can withstand examination. This distinction is fundamental. A successful investigation is not measured only by finding a possible answer. It is measured by the ability to demonstrate that answer through reliable evidence and a fair process. The case was entering a new stage. The uncertainty that had surrounded the disappearances was beginning to give way to accountability. The questions that had remained unanswered for so long were finally moving toward resolution. For the families who had waited, the journey was far from over. For investigators, the responsibility remained enormous. The next steps would determine how the evidence would be evaluated, how justice would proceed, and how the victims would be remembered. The breakthrough had opened the door. Now, the truth had to pass through the courtroom. A breakthrough in a criminal investigation does not mean the journey is finished. It means the direction has changed. After months of uncertainty, investigators finally had a clearer path forward. But discovering information and proving what happened are two very different challenges. The first requires persistence and careful observation. The second requires evidence strong enough to withstand questions, examination, and the strict standards of the justice system. For investigators, the work continued. Every piece of information had to be reviewed carefully. Every timeline had to be examined. Every statement had to be considered in relation to other evidence. The goal was not simply to create a convincing explanation, but to establish a reliable account of events based on facts. This distinction mattered. In the public eye, major cases often appear to reach their conclusion when authorities identify a person connected to the crimes. But for investigators and prosecutors, that moment marks the beginning of another demanding phase. The question changes. It is no longer only, what happened? It becomes, can we prove it? The transition from investigation to prosecution requires precision. Evidence must be organized. Information must be documented. The story of what occurred must be reconstructed in a way that is understandable, accurate, and supported by facts. Behind every major criminal case is an enormous amount of work that rarely receives attention. Files must be reviewed. Records must be organized. Statements must be compared. Legal requirements must be considered. Investigators must prepare for questions that may challenge every part of their work. This process exists because the justice system is designed not only to punish wrongdoing, but also to ensure that decisions are based on reliable evidence. For the families affected by the case, the developing breakthrough represented a complicated moment. For a long time, they had lived with uncertainty. They had waited for information while trying to continue ordinary life. They had experienced the emotional exhaustion of not knowing what had happened to someone they loved. The possibility of answers brought a sense of relief. But answers in cases involving loss are rarely simple. The truth can provide closure, but it can also reopen painful memories. It can confirm fears that families have carried for months or years. It can force people to revisit moments they wished they could leave behind. Still, accountability matters. The purpose of an investigation is not only to identify responsibility. It is also to recognize the harm experienced by victims and their families. It is a process of acknowledging that lives were taken and that those lives had meaning beyond the circumstances that ended them. As the case moved forward, investigators and prosecutors faced the responsibility of presenting the evidence clearly. The courtroom would not examine emotions or speculation. It would examine facts. This meant separating what was known from what was assumed. It meant focusing on evidence rather than public opinion. It meant allowing the legal process to determine the outcome. The attention surrounding the case also created challenges. High-profile investigations often attract intense public interest. Media coverage can help inform communities, but it can also influence perceptions before all facts have been presented. For that reason, investigators had to remain focused on the same principle that guided their work from the beginning. Evidence first. The breakthrough had changed the investigation, but it also revealed broader questions that extended beyond one individual case. How could warning signs be recognized earlier? How could agencies communicate more effectively? How could future investigations respond faster when multiple cases may be connected? These questions would continue to influence discussions among law enforcement professionals and researchers for years afterward. The significance of the case was not only in what happened, but also in what it revealed about the challenges of investigating complex crimes. It demonstrated the importance of cooperation, careful documentation, and the willingness to revisit information when new evidence appears. For the victims' families, however, the meaning of the breakthrough remained deeply personal. They were not thinking about investigative methods or historical significance. They were thinking about the people they had lost. They remembered birthdays, conversations, family traditions, and dreams that would never be completed. They carried memories that existed long before the case became known to the public. The investigation was moving toward a legal conclusion, but the personal consequences would continue for a lifetime. As the evidence was prepared for court, the case entered its final and most public stage. The questions that had surrounded the investigation would now be examined under the rules of the justice system. Witnesses would speak. Evidence would be presented. Arguments would be made. A judgment would eventually be reached. But before the courtroom could deliver its decision, one thing had already become clear. The lives affected by this case deserved to be remembered not because of the tragedy that occurred, but because of who they were before it. The breakthrough brought the investigation closer to justice. It also reminded everyone involved why the search for truth had begun in the first place. The most important moments in an investigation are not always the ones that receive the most attention. A headline may announce an arrest. A camera may capture a courtroom entrance. A public statement may summarize years of work in only a few sentences. But behind those moments is a much longer process. A process built on patience. A process built on verification. A process built on the determination to transform uncertainty into facts. As investigators moved closer to completing their work, their focus shifted from searching for possibilities to preparing a complete understanding of what had occurred. The investigation had gathered enough information to create a clearer picture, but the responsibility remained the same. Every conclusion had to be supported. The difference between suspicion and justice depended on that distinction. Suspicion can begin an investigation. Evidence must complete one. Investigators carefully organized the information they had collected. Timelines were reviewed. Statements were compared. Reports were examined for consistency. The goal was to create a record that could explain not only what happened, but also how authorities reached their conclusions. This process is often invisible to the public. People may see the final result, but they rarely see the thousands of small decisions made along the way. They do not see the hours spent reviewing documents, the conversations repeated many times, or the careful consideration given to every detail. Yet these steps are essential. A criminal case is not built on one moment. It is built on accumulation. Each verified fact adds strength. Each confirmed connection reduces uncertainty. Each piece of evidence helps create a clearer understanding of events. For the families of the victims, this stage represented a difficult emotional transition. For a long time, they had lived with unanswered questions. They had waited for information while trying to continue their lives despite an absence that could not be explained. Now, the possibility of answers was becoming real. But justice in cases like this is complicated. The conclusion of an investigation cannot restore the lives that were lost. It cannot return families to the moment before tragedy occurred. It cannot remove years of grief and memories of what should have been. What it can do is acknowledge the truth. It can establish responsibility. It can ensure that the victims are recognized and remembered. Throughout the investigation, The victims remained the reason the search continued. They were not simply names in reports or evidence files. They were individuals with families, friendships, goals, and futures. That understanding shaped the purpose of the case. The investigation was not only about solving a crime. It was about answering the questions left behind. It was about giving families the information they had waited so long to receive. It was about ensuring that the events were recorded accurately so that the victims would not be remembered only through the actions of the person responsible. As preparations moved toward the legal process, another challenge emerged, presenting a complicated investigation in a way that a court could examine. Courtrooms operate differently from public discussions. Emotion alone is not enough. Public opinion is not enough. A legal decision must be based on evidence presented according to established rules. This meant investigators and prosecutors had to carefully distinguish between what was proven and what was simply believed. Every statement mattered. Every piece of evidence required explanation. Every conclusion needed a foundation. The breakthrough had changed the direction of the case, but the justice process required patience. The investigation had answered many questions, but the next stage would determine how those answers would be judged. For the community, the case had already created lasting changes. Conversations about safety, communication between agencies, and the challenges of investigating connected crimes became more prominent. The events demonstrated how difficult it can be to identify patterns while they are still developing and how important cooperation is when multiple lives are affected. The lessons extended beyond one location and one period in history. They influenced how people thought about prevention, awareness, and investigative responsibility. But for those closest to the victims, the significance remained personal. They remembered people who had once filled their homes with laughter. People who had written letters, made plans, and imagined futures. People whose stories began long before the investigation ever started. The breakthrough represented progress toward accountability, but it also served as a reminder of what had been lost. As the case moved toward the courtroom, the focus would shift from investigation to justice. Evidence collected over months would be examined publicly. Decisions would be made under the standards of the legal system. The search for answers had reached its final stage. The truth had been uncovered through persistence and careful work. Now it would face the judgment of the court. After months of investigation, uncertainty, and unanswered questions, the case entered a new environment. The courtroom. Unlike the investigation, where detectives worked privately through evidence and possibilities, the courtroom placed every detail under public examination. Here, conclusions had to be tested. Claims had to be supported. Evidence had to meet the standards required by law. A criminal trial is not simply a final chapter. It is a process designed to examine the truth carefully. For the families affected by the case, entering this stage brought a mixture of emotions. The investigation had already changed their lives forever. The courtroom represented the possibility of accountability, but it also meant hearing painful details revisited in a public setting. Many families in cases of violent crime describe the justice process as complicated. They want answers, but answers can also reopen wounds. They want responsibility established, but they also know that no legal outcome can restore what was taken from them. Justice cannot reverse time. It cannot return a loved one to a family gathering. It cannot recreate the future someone once imagined. But justice can recognize what happened. It can officially acknowledge the harm caused. It can affirm that victims' lives mattered and that their stories deserve to be remembered. During the trial, prosecutors had the responsibility of presenting the case clearly. They needed to organize years of investigative work into a structure that could be understood within the courtroom. Evidence gathered during the investigation had to be introduced according to legal procedures. Witness accounts, records, and investigative findings all had to be examined carefully. The process required precision. A courtroom does not operate on assumptions. It operates on evidence. Every statement presented could be questioned. Every conclusion could be challenged. The purpose of this process was to ensure that the final decision was based on facts rather than emotion or public pressure. This principle is one of the foundations of the justice system. Even in cases that receive significant public attention, the court must remain focused on what can be proven. For the defense, the responsibility was different. The legal process provides the accused with the right to challenge the evidence presented and to ensure that the proceedings follow established standards. This reflects a broader principle of law. Justice requires fairness, even in cases involving serious and deeply disturbing crimes. The courtroom therefore became a place where two essential responsibilities existed together. The responsibility to protect society and acknowledge victims, and the responsibility to ensure that legal decisions follow proper procedures. As testimony unfolded, the human impact of the case remained impossible to ignore. Behind every piece of evidence was a person whose life had been interrupted. Behind every document was a family that had experienced loss. The victims were not defined by the tragedy that ended their lives. They were students, daughters, friends, people with personalities, ambitions, and relationships that existed long before they became part of a criminal investigation. Remembering that distinction is important in any discussion of true crime. The legal process may focus on evidence and responsibility, but the reason justice exists is because human lives have value. The trial also became an opportunity for the public to understand the challenges investigators had faced. Complex cases often appear simple after they are solved, but the courtroom revealed the careful process required to move from suspicion to proof. The evidence presented showed the importance of patience and cooperation. Investigators had not reached conclusions instantly. They had built them over time. The trial represented the final examination of that work. As the proceedings continued, attention remained focused on the central questions that had guided the investigation from the beginning. What happened? Who was responsible? How could justice be served? For the families waiting for resolution, the legal process offered something they had not had for a long time: certainty. Not comfort. Not restoration. But certainty. And sometimes, after years of unanswered questions, knowing the truth becomes an important part of healing. The conclusion of a trial does not end the impact of a crime. Families continue living with memories and grief long after courtrooms close. Communities continue reflecting on what happened and what lessons can be learned. But the justice system serves a vital purpose. It creates an official record. It establishes accountability. It ensures that the truth is examined rather than forgotten. The case that had begun with disappearances, fear, and uncertainty had now reached a stage where facts would determine the outcome. The courtroom would decide the legal consequences. History would remember the victims. And the community would continue carrying the lessons left behind. A courtroom verdict is often viewed as the final destination of a criminal case. For the public, it can feel like the moment when uncertainty ends. A decision is announced, legal responsibility is established, and the case moves from an active investigation into history. But for the people closest to the tragedy, a verdict is not an ending. It is a moment. A moment that confirms what happened. A moment that places the events into an official record. A moment that acknowledges the suffering of those who were left behind. When the court reached its decision in the case of Edmund Kemper, the legal process had reached the stage where evidence collected over months of investigation was judged according to the standards of the justice system. The outcome reflected the seriousness of the crimes and the responsibility assigned by the court. Kemper received 8 consecutive life sentences for the murders for which he was convicted. The sentence meant that he would spend the remainder of his life in prison, without the possibility of returning to the community. For many people following the case, the sentence represented accountability. For the families of the victims, however, the meaning was more complicated. A sentence can remove a dangerous person from society. It can confirm responsibility. It can provide a sense that the justice system has recognized the harm caused. But it cannot repair the absence left behind. No courtroom decision can restore family conversations that will never happen again. No legal punishment can recreate birthdays, holidays, or ordinary moments that disappeared forever. This is one of the difficult realities of violent crime cases. Justice and healing are not the same thing. The legal system can determine responsibility. It can establish facts. It can provide consequences. But grief follows a different path. Families continue carrying memories long after the media attention fades. They remember the people their loved ones were before they became part of a criminal case. They remember personalities, dreams, and moments that existed far away from the courtroom. Those memories are what keep victims from becoming only names in historical records. The conclusion of the trial also marked a period of reflection for the wider community. The case had exposed difficult questions about public safety, investigative procedures, and the challenges of recognizing patterns before tragedies multiply. It became a case studied by law enforcement professionals, psychologists, and researchers examining violent crime and investigative response. However, the importance of studying such cases is not to focus on the individual responsible. The deeper purpose is prevention. Understanding failures. Improving communication. Recognizing warning signs. Developing better methods for protecting communities. Every investigation leaves behind lessons. Some involve technology. Some involve cooperation between agencies. Some involve how institutions respond when concerns first appear. The case demonstrated that complex crimes often require more than one person or one department. They require collaboration, careful attention to evidence, and a willingness to reconsider information when new facts emerge. The verdict also changed how many people viewed personal safety. Communities that once operated on assumptions of complete trust began having broader conversations about awareness and responsibility. Universities, families, and individuals reconsidered everyday choices and how to balance independence with caution. These changes were not about creating constant fear. They were about understanding reality. Safety often depends on awareness, communication, and the ability to respond when something feels wrong. As years passed, the case continued to receive attention through documentaries, books, and discussions about criminal psychology. However, every retelling carried an important responsibility, remembering that the central human story belonged to the victims and the people who loved them. The person convicted became known because of what he did. The victims were remembered because of who they were. That difference matters. A criminal case can easily become centered on the person responsible because investigations, trials, and media coverage often follow that path. But behind every case file are individuals whose lives contained far more than the circumstances of their deaths. They had families who loved them, friends who missed them, dreams that deserved to continue. The verdict brought legal closure, but it did not erase the questions that remained about how such tragedies could occur. Those questions continued influencing conversations about criminal justice, mental health evaluation, and community awareness. History often remembers major cases through their most shocking details. But the most meaningful lessons are often quieter. They are found in the importance of listening, in taking concerns seriously, in improving systems, in remembering that every victim represents an entire human story. The courtroom had delivered its decision. The investigation had reached its conclusion. But for the families and communities affected, the process of remembering continued. Because justice is not only about what happens to the person responsible. It is also about ensuring that those who were lost are never reduced to the crime committed against them.